Hello and welcome to mentalhealth.now. Today we're going to study about our brain. Now brain is a very broad topic that includes a lot of important information that is not only essential for college exams and viva but also in all types and forms of psychology entrance exams. So we're going to break it into multiple short but comprehensive videos for you. Let's begin with the four lobes of the brain today. Now these are the topic to be covered as part of the four lobes of the brain. However, this video only contains information about the frontal and parietal lobe. Let's get started. Now the outermost layer or the surface of the brain is called the cerebral cortex. In Latin, cortex means bark and it is also sometimes called the neocortex. Now the term neocortex reminds us that it is the most recent brain region to evolve. Now, as you can see in the picture, the cerebral cortex, this layer is not smooth. It has many bumps and folds, and these bumps and folds are called convolutions. Now, based on these bumps and folds, neurologists have identified four lobes. They have divided the entire cortex into four lobes. They are frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Now for easy learning, make a fist with your right hand. Now, roughly speaking, the bends in your fingers, they represent the frontal lobe. Your knuckles represent the parietal lobe. Your wrist area represents the occipital lobe. And your thumb represents the temporal lobe of the left hemisphere. Now, you can also remember the names of these lobes using the acronym FPOT. Okay, so remembering the information about the brain using acronyms is going to be very useful because there is a lot of information that is important with regards to entrance exams, and if you use acronyms, they're going to serve a greater purpose. So for easy learning, the four lobes can be remembered as FPOT. They stand for frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Now, each lobe is associated with particular sensory and motor functions, thought, memory, language, and so on. Now, we will be breaking it all down for you. Let's begin with the frontal lobe. Now, frontal lobes are considered our emotional control center and home to our personality. As the name suggests, frontal lobes are at the front of the brain. Now, this is a quick overview of our frontal lobe, how we know what we are doing within our environment, how we initiate activities in response to our environment, judgments we make about what occurs in our daily lives, controls our emotional response or impulse control, controls our expressive language, assigns meaning to the words we choose, involves word associations. This is a very general overview about what frontal lobe does for us. Let's get into the regions that are involved in the frontal lobe that are of utmost importance to us. Oh yes, motor functions too. Now, there are three regions of the frontal lobe that are of importance to us and that we are going to study about. Prefrontal cortex or lobe is the first one. Thereafter, motor cortex and Broca's area is also involved. So the frontal lobe consists of three areas. I will repeat. We have the prefrontal lobe or cortex, we have the motor cortex, and we have the Broca's area. So the prefrontal cortex is the region that is colored in pink there. Now it controls the executive function and it is just behind the forehead. Now as an executive function or as part of the executive function, it supervises and directs operations of other brain regions. It supervises processes that are associated with perception, memory, emotion, impulse control, long-term planning. Thus, it governs and integrates numerous cognitive and behavioral processes. Let's take an example of this supervisory role. Now, with regards to memory, the prefrontal cortex does not store any memory traces. Okay, so it is not going to store the memory. What it is going to do is, or what its role is to remind us that we have something to remember. Now, another important point to note is that since it integrates information from different cortical regions, from different areas of the brain, different stimuli and information, prefrontal cortex is an association area. That is, an area that combines input from diverse brain regions. Now, what will happen if your prefrontal lobe or cortex is damaged? All the supervisory functions will be impaired. The person may become impulsive or apathetic even. Now think about the prefrontal lobotomies that were performed to treat schizophrenia in the 1950s. Moving to the next region of the frontal lobe, the motor cortex. Now the motor cortex controls the voluntary movement. It sends neural impulses down the spinal cord toward the muscles. Now, the motor cortex lies at the rear of the frontal lobe. And the most interesting thing about motor cortex is that the nerve tracks from the motor cortex, they cross over. They cross over at a point, which means that each hemisphere governs the opposite side of the body. So, for example, if the right motor cortex gets damaged, the left side of the body will get paralyzed. Also, the neurons in the motor cortex are systematically arranged for each part of the body. So, that is to say that it has neurons that are connected to each part of the body. Another important point to note is that since it sends out motor impulse commands to the muscles that is associated with doing only one particular thing, it is called a projection area. What if your motor cortex gets damaged? One thing that I have already mentioned is the paralysis. So, if the right motor cortex is damaged, the left side of the body will be paralyzed and vice versa. Damage to the nearby association area, that is the association area that is near the motor cortex, it can lead to apraxia, that is the inability to execute simple motor responses to a verbal command. So they are very simple motor responses, but you're not able to complete them. So for example, you may be lighting a cigarette or anything else for that matter, and you have a match, you're striking a match against the box. What you do in apraxia is you continuously strike the match against the box even after it is lit, and if it is lit, you do not light the thing, you take it in your mouth, you do something else. So this ability to execute that simple motor function, that is impaired. Third part of the frontal lobe is the Broca's area. It is usually found only in one hemisphere, that is the so-called dominant one, and in most people the dominant hemisphere is the left hemisphere. So Broca's area is usually found in the left hemisphere. Now Broca's area was named after Paul Broca, who studied the behavioral deficits of people with brain damage. Now, this area is involved in speech production. Now, what will happen if Broca's area gets damaged? The person's ability to produce speech will be damaged, which is called Broca's aphasia. Now, in Broca's aphasia, you will be unable to, speak fluently, you may mispronounce words, or you may speak haltingly. Now, speaking haltingly is another way to say that you're not able to speak as fluently as you were able before Broca's aphasia. Now, a quick recap of the frontal lobe. We discussed the three major regions of frontal lobe so far. That involves the prefrontal cortex, Broca's area, and the motor cortex. Now, let's move on to the parietal lobe. Now, it is located at the rear of the frontal lobe. Now, parietal lobe has two important regions that you should know about. But before coming to that, let's have a quick overview about what parietal lobe does or what it is involved in. It is a location for visual attention, location for touch perception, goal-directed voluntary movements, manipulation of objects, integrating different senses that allows for understanding a single concept. Now, when we read or when we know about the regions that are involved in parietal lobe and the functions they perform, these overview or these aspects, they become more clear to us. So moving forward, there are two important regions of the parietal lobe, the somatosensory cortex and the central region of this parietal lobe. So the somatosensory cortex, the soma means body and sensory means body sensations. So you're basically talking about bodily sensations. Now it processes information about bodily sensations, the incoming sensory signals for touch, temperature, pressure and pain. Now I like to call it the T2 P2 senses. So since it is it's an acronym and it makes it easier to learn or remember. So since it works with the incoming sensory information, it is a projection area that we have already discussed before what a projection area is. Now, despite certain differences, the motor cortex that we discussed as part of the frontal lobe and the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe, they are so connected, they are so interrelated and work together that they are sometimes called the sensory motor cortex. Now, coming to the central region of the parietal lobe, it is associated with spatial processing and manipulation. Now, this is the region that helps us orient ourselves in 3D space, to do spatial manipulation of block design, and to apply the spatial orientation skills like, reading a map. Now, what will happen if your parietal lobe gets damaged? Now, if your left parietal lobe gets damaged, you will get something called the Gertzmann syndrome. It includes the left-right confusion, you have difficulty writing, you have difficulty with mathematics, it may produce disorders of the language, and you may also have difficulty in perceiving objects in a normal manner. If your right parietal lobe gets damaged, you may neglect part of the body or space, which basically impairs many self-care skills like dressing or washing. So if you are washing, you may just wash one side of your body and not the other. You may have difficulty in making things, constructing things, denial of deficits, and there may be difficulties in your drawing ability. If there is bilateral damage, you may develop something called the Bellins syndrome. It is a visual attention and motor syndrome which is characterized by the inability to voluntarily control the gaze, to integrate components of a visual scene. Now, when you view something, when you perceive a scene, there are a lot of things that you perceive. Now, you're not consciously aware of perceiving each and everything. You just have an overview. You just get an overview in your brain. You get a picture. Now, in this syndrome, there will be difficulty in integrating the components of that scene. You may not be able to accurately reach for an object with visual guidance. So for a quick recap of the parietal lobe, there are two important regions that we discussed, the somatosensory cortex and the central region of the parietal lobe. So in this video, we discussed about the frontal and parietal lobe as part of the 4 lobes video. Now, the occipital and the temporal lobes will be discussed in the next video. So stay tuned for next week, and thank you so much for watching.
Don't forget to like and subscribe our channel. Hit the bell icon to get updates on every time we upload a new video. Stay connected and thank you so much for watching.